midst of World War I. Glasgow was booming. The shipyards were working all the time, 7 days a week. And of course, housing was very, very scarce. People were squeezed into flats. You'd have maybe 2 rooms for a whole family of 6 or 7 people. And of course, maintenance was horrendous. The flats weren't well heated in the winter. That was just very, very, very poor housing. So that was the background out of which came the Great Rent Strike of 1915. In the shipyards, they were working full time, more than full time actually, 7 days a week, trying to produce warships for World War I, and thus this was Glasgow was a vital part of the war effort. In fact, the British government took very seriously what was happening on the Clyde, because an awful lot of the ships that were fighting the Germans came out of Glasgow and Clyde. So that was the context in which all this was happening. In that situation, the landlords started raising the rents because housing was scarce. They could get away with it. And in response to that, the women of Govan organized a rent strike. So they stopped paying the rents. And the rent strike started spreading from Govan throughout other parts of Glasgow. And of course, the landlords tried to respond, and their first response was to send out bailiffs to evict the people who weren't paying rent. But there were popular protests. The women were mobilized in the neighborhood, and they would block the bailiffs from coming in and start throwing flour bags at the bailiffs, and the bailiffs would finally withdraw. So that was the context in which the landlords decided the next step they would do is they would collect the rent by deducting from the wages of the shipyard workers. The production in the shipyards was so vital, gave the shipyard workers a certain leverage, a certain amount of power, and they were organized, and they used it. Now, of course, the government tried to suppress discontent in the shipyards as much as they could, and strikes were illegal. But nonetheless, they happened. They were short, quickie strikes quite often in the shipyards during World War I. Definitely, the rent strikes didn't happen out of nothing. They were organized. They were organized by women who, in fact, were experienced political people. They had been militant suffragists before this, and they were in an organization called the Independent Labor Party as well, a socialist organization. But absolutely, it was organized. The rent strike was organized in Govan by that core group, and it swept in all kinds of people, initially women and then the shipyard workers. And it was an extremely exhilarating experience, because here they were on the move. They were mobilizing tens of thousands of people. They were having an impact. They couldn't be ignored. And eventually they won a victory. So it was a huge boost to everybody's morale. Okay, well, when the thousands of people marched on the Sheriff's Court, it was a big event. Again, because part of that reason that was true was a lot of the men came along with their wives. And when they did that, they left the shipyards, which meant the shipyards were shut down in the midst of the war. So it was a huge event. And when they got to the Sheriff's Court, they came from different parts. One march came from Govan, but there were marches from other parts of the city as well. And they all converged on George Square and then the Sheriff's Court. So the streets around the Sheriff's Court were blocked with protesters, and some of the leaders would get on sandwich boards from the newspaper kiosks. They would be held up by some sturdy men, and they would give speeches on top of that. So it's hard to visualize, but they didn't have microphones. They just bellowed. And one of those was John McLean. John McLean was one of the people on the sandwich boards denouncing the landlords and calling for a rent freeze. So here was all the streets in around the Sheriff's Court in the city center of Glasgow were blocked, and the protesters sent a delegation of shipyard workers into the sheriff to meet with the sheriff. They told the sheriff if any of the people involved were evicted because they refused to pay the rent, there would be a strike at the shipyards. And the sheriff called up Lloyd George, who at the time was Minister of Munitions, and said, "There's going to be a strike of the shipyards in Glasgow. What should we do?" And Lloyd George said, we will make sure that rents are frozen during the war, and they were. So that was a victory, a huge victory, and it wasn't not just important in and of itself. It was good that they froze the rents, but it showed the power that people had if they could mobilize, organize around a concrete issue, and actually show their power.
Since the First World War, there was some social and economic progress, then a depression, then the Second World War, some rejuvenation after the war, then a welfare state.
But the merry-go-round continued of deindustrialisation, deregulation, appropriation of public assets, along with the establishment of the for-profit war machine.
In Glasgow, the final industrial nail in the coffin was the closure of most shipbuilding and heavy industry, which left a demoralised workforce with little to look forward to or hope for. This can be summarised in Stanley Checkland's famous analogy of the upas tree in shipbuilding in Glasgow, which still rings true today as it did between 1875 and 1975. It goes,
"The evergreen expanding branches of the upas tree blocks off the sun and kills off anything that attempts to grow below it. Therefore, when the tree itself is cut down, there is nothing left below its branches to develop and grow."
And it is an analogy that can be drawn out time and again over the last 50 years.
The technological age was the great promise to replace heavy engineering. It did have some promise in Silicon Glen, lasting 10 years before going in the same direction as all other manufacturing, to where labour was cheap and people could be easily exploited. Like the industrial age, which the poor built and the rich benefited from, the same is true of the technological age that the poor pay for and the rich benefit from. Look at the poorest towns in the north of England and you will find the towns that drove the Industrial Revolution. Why are they the poorest? Why is all of the wealth with the banking families in the south?
At least in the Industrial Revolution, folk had a job. Now the technology that they have paid for is being used to even more effectively than the Industrial Revolution to rob and exploit them by shifting jobs abroad to a modern-day industrial cesspit of starvation labour. The technology that can move anywhere has moved to the same place as manufacturing did during the industrial era.
What is left for the domestic population who are unskilled, untrained and unneeded? Food banks, in-work poverty of 0 hours contracts and minimum pay and endless social cleansing. This also puts the now proven Glasgow effect into perspective. From a report where some of the real reasons leading to the present social decline and poverty in the city can be explained. This is from a Herald newspaper article entitled "Revealed: Glasgow Effect, Mortality Rate Blamed on Westminster Social Engineering." In Glasgow's case, the skills of the city were also moved out under the government policy of creating the disadvantages leading to what they termed a failed city.
The Scottish Office implemented social engineering policies that it knew to be damaging to the long-term health of Glaswegians. The report claims to offer evidence reasons for so-called Glasgow effect, the phenomenon which sees more people die prematurely in Glasgow than can be accounted for by poverty alone in comparison to the rest of the UK. Researchers who spent years working on the project and examined 40 different theories claim that radical urban planning in the 1960s and 70s aimed at promoting economic growth was a key factor which made Glaswegians vulnerable to the devastating effects of deprivation and bad housing. The mortality rate is 15% higher in Glasgow across all social classes and ages, while premature mortality, dying under 65, is 30% higher and much higher among the poorest in the city. The so-called Glasgow effect means more people die from cancer, heart disease, strokes, as well as drugs, alcohol and suicide than do in other comparable cities. In one policy document from 1971 entitled The Glasgow Crisis, it was noted that the city was in a socially and economically dangerous position as a result of the policy which amounted to a very powerful case for drastic action to reverse present trends within the city. However, the policy continued to be rolled out regardless, a decision which fueled the breakup of communities and a chronic lack of investment in housing or repairs in housing schemes such as Easter House, Drumchapel and Castlemilk. As well as Westminster's social engineering, the report finds that a range of other factors also made Glaswegians more vulnerable to the effects of poverty and deprivation when compared with data from Liverpool and Manchester, which in the earlier part of the 20th century had similar levels of mortality to Glasgow. The Scottish city started to fall behind considerably in later years. Researchers found that the historic effect of overcrowding was an important factor and highlighted the strategies of local government, which prioritised the regeneration of the city centre over investment in the city's housing schemes as having a significant impact on the health of Glaswegians. Data shows that Glasgow authorities spent far less on housing repairs, leaving people's homes poorly maintained and subject to damp. David Walsh of the Glasgow Centre for Population Health said that their work proved that poor health had political causes and could not simply be attributed to individual lifestyle choices. He added, "The principal reasons for poor health in Glasgow are poverty and deprivation, and this shouldn't be forgotten. However, even given its very high levels of deprivation, Glasgow has much, much worse health than it should have, and much worse than in comparably deprived cities like Liverpool, Manchester and Belfast, cities that had been through the same process of deindustrialisation. Until now, this has been an unexplained phenomenon, but this new research is based on assessment of a huge amount of evidence and is not speculation-based. The Scottish Office documents were particularly revealing," he claimed. The Scottish Office embarked on a series of policies that effectively wrote off the city. They designated it a declining city, and their plans focused on economic growth elsewhere, he added. This was a policy that went on for decades despite an awareness that this was having a massively negative impact in socio-economic terms and therefore on health.
Now in the elite's never-ending need is even a need to profit off poverty by a continual process of destabilisation and destitution and turn the city into parking land lots available for business opportunities.
In the front of the People's Palace in Glasgow Green stands an ornate fountain that has become the centrepiece of the space and found a place in people's hearts, a jewel of the city. But if you look closer, you will discover the monument has little in common with the ethos of the People's Palace as a place of local people's history, but is in fact a monument to the British Empire. Some have argued why it was removed from another part of the park and plonked directly in front of the People's Palace, a place that records the struggle of ordinary people, the same as those who struggled against the colonisation of their countries by the imperialists the monument represents. In another area of the park, at the end of a tree-lined path, you can find a more contemporary monument we are encouraged to love. The 3D symbol of the Commonwealth Games, or part of the celebration of Britain's former territories. These are here because colonisers never let things go. What has happened to the east end of our city over the last 50 years is nothing short of colonisation and social cleansing. The city that was famous for having a motorway running through it needed those in its way to be shifted long before the work began. The blight of the East End didn't happen overnight. It was a long-term planned project. The destruction of the last vestiges of the older communities in the East End, such as Kilmarnock, which was flattened to accommodate a week or two of sport, laid the whole of the East End wide open to profiteers. If that's not colonisation, I don't know what is.
It is probably difficult for those at the opposite end of the city to comprehend what has happened to the East End of Glasgow, unless a concerted effort to get into a car and look, because only by car can you comprehend the scale of the destruction.
These are never going to exist again in this part of the world. The sheer size of these buildings is symbolic of the post-war social consensus. The idea that what you had in Glasgow was these overcrowded inner city tenements. And there was the idea that people were going to get better housing, and they were going to move out, they were going to get this light, this modernist ideal of light and fresh air and so forth. But there was still the idea, of course, of the social, of the community. So that's what you have here. You have 5,000 people, but it's a community that's here. As I say, we get this problem, this horrific word, but residualisation, which really brings the place down.
Is this the city where hopes and dreams can flourish? Let's look at some ideas. People of all economic groupings need to become involved in deciding and designing real infrastructure for their community needs in the fight against residualisation, where the weakest are left to fight for themselves in isolation and broken communities. We need to become educators and visionaries of our own future and start looking outward and start with the things we can do.
Today the relationship to what is being built is between the architect and the client rather than the people who will live in or use the building.
Victor Papanek, the author of Design for the Real World, explains, with the vast amounts of taxpayers' money spent by the authorities on public works, how then are the public expected to assess such public building projects in terms of their usefulness to the community? Architecture and design are treated as vocational subjects. Why are design and architecture not treated as social subjects early on at school? In a multi-materialistic society, the assessment of design quality in building and when purchasing goods would be of economic and practical use to most people. After all, we are born in buildings and spend most of our lives in them.
People send their kids and parents attend dance classes, drama class, art classes. Less than 1% of these children will take up dancing, acting or art as a full-time career. Yet classes are crowded because they are enjoyed. For while most of us do not take up professional dancing or indeed professional architecture, we all do spend most of our lives in buildings. Therefore, the closer the education topic is to the reality of the situation, the more relevant the lesson. So why do we not teach architecture to children?
There is a need for us to become our own experts. When so much of the development of our environment is in the control of experts and usually paid for with public money, why isn't some of that budget put aside in order that the public can employ their own representative experts unless they can do it themselves, who would work to inform the community of the social and economic impact of major building works in their areas? We need to ask, where do we go from here? Where do we find the inspiration to win things? So the 1915 rent strike didn't have the internet. They had pots and pans, whistles and rattles, solidarity and solid organisation. The Merrillese strike to defend the whole council estate had numbers. The poll tax against another of Thatcher's hatchet jobs in the poor had sheer audacity and numbers. The people of Reedvale Denison didn't know what they were doing when they demanded and succeeded in saving their homes and community from the bulldozers in 1980s. They didn't know what they were doing, but they knew what they wanted. The visionary architects of the 60s actually built the kind of social homes people needed. Some social housing was built so well the private sector fought to demolish them as the standard of council housing surpassed that of private dwellings. We could look at these models again. Clachan Co-Housing Group in Maryhill also know what they want, is working on a project looking to build houses and creating alternative models of living together. Spain's high rents bring young and old under one roof, connecting different generations to live together for social as well as economic reasons. Kelvinside Meadows fighting the developers and winning to keep green space wide open. Cotec is a network of 40 cooperatives. It aims to create a better technology sector in the UK that focuses primarily on workers, customer end users' needs rather than on generating private profit. Renfrew and Falkirk are the only places in the country with state-owned housing. Apart from that, social housing as we know it does not exist. Maybe we need to reinvent it. Living Rent, Scotland's tenants' union, is after permanent rent regulation and are an inspiration and solidarity, focused aims and the wherewithal to carry them out. In Berlin, there are grassroots plans to renationalise up to 200,000 ex-council homes from corporate landlords. We could do this too. Barcelona's new mayor has made housing a top priority, even above tourism and corporate profits. Things have gotten so bad, and so could we. In Vienna, social housing has been taken out of the ghetto mentality. In parts of Vienna where you live, you'll find all kinds of social groupings, and for them this is one of the most important things they want to do, and so should we. Guerrilla architecture has stepped in to turn abandoned sites in Seville and other Spanish cities into dramatic art spaces that are inspiring a new breed of architect. People before icons, community before profits is their call. You can find inspiration and ideas in Europe and even further abroad. Detroit has 1,400 urban farms growing out of urban decay where there was nothing. They asked the question, do we fight for supermarkets or do we feed ourselves? Do we fight for schools or do we teach our own kids? A ton of ideas growing up around growing, co-ops and place-based learning. Zapatistas and the revolutionary women's laws include reproductive health facilities, access to technology and education, small business support, independent decision making, not being physically, mentally and emotionally abused. Where are these things here? And also among the Kurdish women's movement, thinking about women in life in all of its aspects. We are against the opinion that the women's question is just related to women's problems. Everything that happens is related to women. We deal with issues ranging from ecology to science and to the arts. And speaking of ecology, we here also have our own homegrown sources of inspiration.
Scotland's Common Good Fund is 500 years old and consists of hundreds of millions of pounds of assets that are publicly owned. Why would ordinary people ignore such valuable assets accrued over so many years by so many unless they were hidden from view? Hundreds of millions of pounds worth of assets that are publicly owned out of sight. We need to ask why, and we need to start claiming them.
Throughout our history we have come up with ideas that seem revolutionary now and were even then. The men and women of the Scottish Enlightenment formed what one of the foremost historians of the movement has called a self-consciously cosmopolitan European philosophic family. They did this through opening up knowledge to the world so folk could commune with it and each other, not to weaponise knowledge against people. Maybe we need a second Enlightenment.
Patrick Geddes was a Scottish biologist and sociologist who was one of the modern pioneers of the concept of town and regional planning. In 1887, while working at the University of Edinburgh, Geddes opened the first of a series of student residencies at Riddles Court. It was an independent, extra-academical experiment, and University Hall remained autonomous and self-governing. It began with 10 rooms and 7 students who had the right to elect new residents and manage the internal affairs of the residence. An idea for today's student in their private debt-ridden living conditions. Furthering his expertise in town planning, Geddes worked to improve the slums of Edinburgh and later the planning of other cities by focusing on the relationship between inhabitants and their surrounding environment. City gardens began with Geddes to help allow people, especially children, to experience the natural world. That was over 100 years ago.
Ian McHarg was born in Clydebank in 1920. He was a Scottish ecologist and landscape architect who made his name in the University of Pennsylvania, where he founded the world-famous Department of Landscape Architecture and Regional Planning in 1955. The Scottish office in Westminster had no need for McHarg's revolutionary architecture and ideas for housing, and he set off to the States, where the rest is history. So if we don't support and encourage the McHargs of today, how do we plan for the so much needed ecological development of tomorrow? There are also many avenues to change the system, even within the system itself. The fight against deregulation, which is really what it's all about, from housing to education to what we eat, as well as local groups creating pressure. There is a Scottish Housing Quality Standard, we have the Right to Repair Act, Scottish Building Standard of Construction, the Administrative Justice System, the Community Empowerment Act, the Freedom of Information Act. We have the freedom to organise, cooperate and change things. What's to stop us? So the question might be, how do we galvanise a movement to build institutional power?
So this is Walt Whitman. This is the city and I am one of its citizens. Whatever interests the rest interests me. Politics, wars, markets, newspapers, schools, the mayor and councils, banks, tariffs, steamships, factories, stocks, stores, real estate and personal estate. What Whitman is suggesting in this statement is, to be effective as citizens we need to be keeping more than one idea in our head at the same time, because life tends not to be linear, one thing then the next. It is more about intersections of ideas that flow around over and under each other that we have to weave together to create understanding.
So we could ask, what was the understanding that made the 1915 rent strike so effective? Was it that strikers were connected by social bonds, families, activists living in close proximity to each other? Was it 20,000 people working for a single employer? Was it fighting a war, both at home and abroad? The ongoing battle of suffrage against injustice and acting against it? Was it due to syndicalist-type organisations like the Independent Labour Party Committee, driven from the bottom up, not dictated ideologies? Was it starvation and a desperate need that something had to be done? Whatever it was, either of these things, ultimately it was a realisation of understanding where their power lies. Without getting into the heads of individual strikers, we will never know, but one thing that we could agree upon is, without discovering where our power lies, how we are expected to fight it or dismantle elite power. To be sure, we have today a plethora of tools in helping to decipher and analyse history, but as Chomsky reminds us, if you look over the developments in recent years, there's been severe retrogression in economic and political issues, but considerable progress on cultural and social issues.
There are plenty of things happening in our communities that relate to cultural and social change and making people's lives a bit better, and we need these things, but it is not enough. Elites, banks and corporations are happy if that's all we do, and will even go out of their way to sponsor these things, because cultural distraction and single issue groupings can be used to divide, subdivide and subdivide again, and because cultural and social issues do not hurt what elites hold dear, namely the economic and political system they control.
That's why the 1915 rent strike was so successful, because strikers had discovered not only where their power lay, but how to use it to hurt what the elite hold dear: profits. Thatcher understood who controls the rent controls the people, who controls the organisers controls the country. The biggest fear of the rentier is that ordinary people start to understand this, as they did in 1915 Glasgow, where they used the might of their power against the rentier and won.
But as Gramsci intones, we need to have wider social goals than the preservation of only our own physiological and moral integrity in order to survive. If the human goal is no longer mere survival, but a particular standard of survival, then greater efforts need to be expended towards these higher human goals.
Shelter is something we all require, and the present housing struggle could be used as a collective demand around cultural and social issues, and work towards collective broader aims that could help to unify single-issue groups around economic and political issues that our joint power could actually win.